The cards fell like autumn leaves, red, black, and deadly. Jake Morrison's calloused fingers worked the deck with the fluid precision of 20 years spent reading men's souls through their poker faces. The Broken Wheel Saloon reeked of whiskey sweat and the particular desperation that clung to mining towns like dust on a summer road. Across the felt table, 3 faces stared back at him through a haze of tobacco smoke. To his left sat Silas Kane, the mine foreman, whose reputation for violence preceded him like thunder before lightning. Kane's pale eyes never blinked, never wavered, studying Jake with the intensity of a rattlesnake, calculating the perfect moment to strike. His massive hands, scarred from years of backbreaking labor, rested motionless beside his cards, but Jake could see the tension coiled in his shoulders like a spring wound, too tight. Beside Kane slouched Billy Garrett, barely 20, but already carrying himself with the swagger of a man who'd killed and expected to kill again. The pearl-handled Colt at his hip wasn't just for show. Jake had seen him draw 3 days ago when a drifter made the mistake of questioning Billy's parentage. The drifter was pushing up daisies now in Boot Hill's rocky soil, and Billy wore his reputation like a badge of honor. The third player was the most dangerous, though he looked harmless as a church deacon counting Sunday collection. Dr. Martin Kellaway possessed the soft hands of a man who'd never done honest labor, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed human beings as chess pieces, to be moved or sacrificed as the game demanded. He ran the territorial government's mining commission, which meant he controlled who lived and who died in Copper Creek with a stroke of his well-manicured pen. "Your bet, Morrison." Kane rumbled his voice, carrying the grinding undertone of millstones crushing grain. "Though I'm wondering if a saddle tramp like you can cover the stakes we're playing for." Jake studied his cards, 3 queens, and a pair of 7s full house queens high. Strong hand, but in this game, strength mattered less than nerve. These men weren't just gambling with money. They were staking claims to power territory and the right to extract wealth from Copper Creek's silver veins, while others bled and died in the darkness beneath the mountain. "Depends on what stakes you're talking about." Jake replied, his voice steady as Sunday church bells. He'd learned long ago that showing fear in places like this was tantamount to signing your own death warrant. "This here's just a friendly game among gentlemen, ain't it?" Billy snorted the sound, carrying all the sophisticated charm of a pig rooting for truffles. "Ain't nothing friendly about business, old man. And make no mistake, everything in Copper Creek is business." The kid was trying to provoke him, Jake realized. Get him angry, get him sloppy, maybe get him dead if the cards fell wrong. But Jake had survived the war. Between the states survived Comanche raids, and Apache fury survived corrupt sheriffs and crooked judges from Texas to Montana. He wasn't about to let some punk kid with quick hands and a quicker temper put him in the ground. "All in," he said quietly, pushing his entire stake, $200 in silver coins, into the center of the table. The metal clinked like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, but the sound carried all the weight of a funeral bell in the sudden silence. Kane's eyebrows rose a fraction, the first sign of emotion he'd shown all evening. Mighty confident for a man riding a $10 horse and wearing boots that have seen better decades. "You sure you want to make that play?" Before Jake could answer, the saloon's batwing doors burst open with a crash that made every man in the place reach for his gun. A figure stumbled through the entrance, a Paiute warrior, maybe 19 years old, his buckskin shirt dark with blood that wasn't entirely his own. In his right hand, he clutched a cavalry saber, its blade notched and stained. His left arm hung useless at his side, and his dark eyes burned with the fever of a man who'd seen too much death in too short a time. "White soldiers," he gasped in heavily accented English, his words carrying the urgency of a man delivering his last message before joining his ancestors in the spirit world. "Coming here." with blue coats and killing hearts. They burned sacred springs, killed women, children, old ones who could not run fast enough. The silence that followed was thick as molasses and twice as poisonous. Every man in the broken wheel knew what the massacre of sacred springs meant. The uneasy peace that had kept Copper Creek profitable was shattered like glass beneath a hammer blow. War was coming to their doorstep, and war meant death for anyone caught in its path. Kane was the first to recover his practical mind, already calculating angles and opportunities like a predator sensing wounded prey. Boys talking about Colonel McCready's expedition. Word came through territorial dispatch this morning, orders to clear hostile Indians from mineral-rich territories by any means necessary. Any means necessary. Dr. Kellaway repeated, savoring the words like fine wine. Such delightfully flexible language from our friends in Washington gives a man considerable latitude in how he interprets his civic responsibilities. The Paiute warrior's legs gave out, and he collapsed against the bar with a thud that rattled bottles on their shelves. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading, while his breathing came in shallow gasps that spoke of internal injuries no frontier medicine could heal. Someone ought to help him, Jake said, rising from his chair with the deliberate movements of a man whose sense of right and wrong had been tempered in fires that had burned weaker men to ash. Someone ought to mind their own business. Billy snarled his hand, dropping to rest on his gun butt with casual menace. That savage ain't nothing but bad news and trouble walking on two legs. Smart money says we put him out of his misery before he brings his war party down on our heads. Boy's got a point. Kane agreed, though his eyes remained fixed on Jake with predatory interest. Dead Indians tell no tales, and live ones bring federal complications nobody wants to explain to territorial authorities. But Jake was already moving his conscience, overriding his survival instincts, in the way that had nearly gotten him killed more times than he cared to count. He knelt beside the wounded warrior, noting the clean entrance wound high on his left shoulder, and the way the kid's pupils were dilated despite the saloon's bright lamplight. "You got a name, son?" he asked gently, his voice carrying the respect one warrior owed another, regardless of race or tribe. Tom Lightfoot." The words came out in a whisper that carried the weight of mountains. White name, white school back east. But I am still Paiute in my heart, in my blood. Still remember the old ways, the old songs my grandmother sang before the soldiers came with fire and death. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach like a lead weight. Sacred Springs had been a neutral trading post protected by federal treaty, and the kind of mutual self-interest that kept commerce flowing smoothly between white settlers and native tribes. If Colonel McCready had attacked it, if he'd killed women and children in violation of every law of war and human decency, then the situation was far worse than anyone in Copper Creek suspected. "How many soldiers?" he asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "2 companies, maybe more following behind. They have wagons loaded with ammunition and supplies for long campaign. This is not raid, this is war party that means to stay until every Indian in territory is dead or driven away from their silver." The last word hung in the air, like gun smoke, heavy with implications that made every man in the saloon recalculate his position in the deadly game they'd all been playing. Silver was the blood that kept Copper Creek's heart beating, the reason any of them were here instead of back east living civilized lives. But silver meant nothing if you were dead, and Colonel McCready's actions had just painted a target on every white settlement within 100 miles. "We need to get word to Fort Laramie," Jake said, addressing the room, but keeping his voice pitched for Kane and Kellaway. These men controlled Copper Creek's destiny, and their decisions in the next few minutes would determine whether the town survived or joined the growing list of settlements that existed only as burned-out ruins and unmarked graves. Request additional troops, official protection from what? Kane interrupted his voice, carrying harsh amusement that held no warmth whatsoever. From justice. From the consequences of expanding American civilization into lands that were never ours to take in the first place. The question revealed more about Kane's philosophy than Jake had expected. The mine foreman wasn't just a brutal thug who used violence to maintain order. He was a man who understood exactly what he was doing and why someone who'd made peace with moral compromises that would have broken weaker souls. From reprisal attacks. Jake clarified, though he suspected Kane already knew the answer. Sacred Springs was neutral ground, protected by treaty. If McCready violated federal law by attacking it, then every tribe within 500 miles is going to consider every white settlement fair game for revenge. Dr. Kellaway cleared his throat with the delicate precision of a man accustomed to having his words treated as gospel truth by territorial authorities. Actually, gentlemen, I believe you'll find that recent modifications to federal Indian policy have rendered such treaties, shall we say, considerably less binding than they once were. The Department of the Interior has embraced a more pragmatic approach to territorial development, one that prioritizes economic expansion over sentimental attachments to outdated diplomatic arrangements. Translation: Washington had decided genocide was more profitable than negotiation, and men like Kellaway were happy to provide the legal justification for mass murder, as long as the silver kept flowing eastward in satisfactory quantities. Tom Lightfoot tried to push himself upright, his warrior's pride refusing to let him die, lying on a saloon floor like a drunk sleeping off a 3-day bender. Blood frothed at the corners of his mouth, internal bleeding Jake realized probably from broken ribs puncturing his lungs. The kid had minutes, maybe less, before his body gave up the fight. His spirit was determined to continue. White man's law. Tom gasped each word, costing him precious breath he couldn't spare. You speak of treaties and territorial policy like they are sacred things that cannot be broken. But your people break every promise when it becomes inconvenient. My grandmother taught me your Bible says you should not murder, should not steal, should not bear false witness. But your colonel does all these things in name of civilization and progress. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, challenging every man present to examine his conscience and find it wanting. These weren't abstract moral questions debated in Eastern universities. They were life and death decisions that would be measured in blood and silver before the week was finished. Billy's patience snapped like an overtaxed rope. I've heard enough of this savage's propaganda. Time to end this conversation permanent-like. His hand moved toward his gun with fluid speed that would have impressed professional gunfighters from Dodge City to Tombstone. But Jake had been watching, waiting, reading the kid's body language like a book written in familiar script. His own Colt cleared leather in a blur of practiced motion, the barrel coming to rest against Billy's temple with mathematical precision. I wouldn't complete that draw if I were you, son, Jake said conversationally, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he were discussing the weather or the price of hay. Man's got a right to speak his piece before he dies, regardless of what color his skin happens to be. Billy froze his gun, half-drawn muscles locked in indecision between pride and survival. Around the saloon, other patrons moved their hands carefully away from their weapons, recognizing the electric tension that preceded sudden death in places where civilization was maintained at gunpoint. Kane studied the tableau with professional interest, as if he were watching a particularly fascinating surgical procedure rather than a confrontation that could leave multiple men dead on the sawdust-covered floor. Mighty protective of a dying Indian you just met, Morrison. Makes a man wonder where your loyalties truly lie in matters of racial solidarity. My loyalties lie with treating wounded men decent, regardless of what color they happen to be wearing on the outside. Jake's gun never wavered, though he could feel sweat beading on his forehead, despite the evening's cool temperature. Beyond that, I'm not looking for trouble with anyone in this room who isn't looking to start it with me. Noble sentiment, Dr. Kellaway observed with clinical detachment. Though I suspect you'll find that neutrality becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as circumstances evolve. Events have a way of forcing men to choose sides, whether they want to or not. Before anyone could respond to that ominous prediction, Tom Lightfoot's breathing stopped with a final shuddering exhale that seemed to carry his spirit away on winds only he could feel. His dark eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling, no longer burning with fever and determination, but empty as winter sky. Jake holstered his weapon and gently closed the dead warrior's eyes with the respect due a fallen soldier, regardless of which army he'd served or which cause he'd died defending. Someone ought to see he gets buried proper. Man fought bravely and died trying to warn his enemies of danger. That takes more courage than most of us will ever possess. Touching eulogy, Kane said dryly, "Though I suspect you'll find that courage is about to become considerably less rare in these parts. When word spreads about sacred springs, every warrior between here and the Pacific is going to be testing his courage against white settlements." Billy finally relaxed and holstered his half-drawn gun, though his face remained flushed with embarrassment at being outdrawn by a man old enough to be his father. "We should burn the body. Send message to any other savages thinking about bringing their troubles to Copper Creek. We should bury him with dignity and hope that dignity earns us some small measure of mercy when his people come looking for answers." Jake countered firmly. "Man's death means something whether we acknowledge it or not. Question is whether we want it to mean justice or just more fuel for the fire that's already burning." The philosophical debate was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, many horses moving fast, with military precision that could be heard even over the saloon's background noise of conversation, clinking glasses, and off-key piano music. Through the dusty windows, they could see torches approaching like fallen stars, their light reflecting off brass buttons and cavalry sabers that caught the lamplight with deadly gleam. "Speak of the devil." Kane murmured, his voice carrying grim satisfaction. "Looks like Colonel McCready's come calling." Colonel Thaddeus McCready filled the doorway, like divine judgment made manifest in blue wool and brass buttons. He stood 6'4" in his polished boots, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of manifest destiny, and eyes cold as January creek water. His uniform was immaculate, despite the hard ride from Sacred Springs, every button gleaming, every crease sharp enough to cut glass. Behind him stood a dozen cavalry troopers, their weapons held at port arms with the casual readiness of men accustomed to violence. The saloon fell silent as a church service conversation's dying mid-sentence, while every man present tried to look like he'd been minding his own business rather than debating the moral implications of genocide. Jake remained kneeling beside Tom Lightfoot's body, his hands folded in respect, his eyes studying the colonel with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to recognize different breeds of killers. "Gentlemen," McCready's voice carried the crisp authority of West Point training and 20 years of frontier service, each word precisely articulated, like orders being carved in stone. "I trust you've all been enjoying a peaceful evening of recreation and commercial intercourse." His gaze swept the room, cataloging faces and weapons with professional thoroughness before settling on the corpse at Jake's feet. "I see you've had an unexpected visitor. Pity he didn't survive long enough to answer some questions about recent activities in the Sacred Springs region." Kane rose smoothly from his chair, his massive frame moving with surprising grace for such a large man. "Colonel McCready, welcome to Copper Creek. I'm Silas Kane, mine foreman for the Territorial Development Commission. This here's Dr. Kellaway, who handles our regulatory affairs, and various other citizens of good standing and questionable moral character. Mr. Kane, McCready's nod acknowledged the introduction without warmth. I trust you received the territorial dispatch regarding enhanced security measures for mining operations in contested regions. Indeed, we did. Most illuminating reading, if I may say so. Kane's smile revealed teeth that had been broken and badly repaired, giving him the appearance of a predator that had survived too many battles to count. I take it your expedition to Sacred Springs proceeded according to operational parameters. The carefully neutral language couldn't disguise what they were really discussing and the systematic massacre of women, children, and old men who'd committed no crime beyond occupying land that contained valuable minerals. Jake felt his jaw clench as he listened to these men discuss mass murder, with the clinical detachment of accountants reviewing ledger books. Operational objectives were achieved within acceptable casualty parameters. McCready confirmed his tone, suggesting he was discussing livestock management rather than human lives. However, certain complications arose that require immediate attention from local civic leaders. Complications. Dr. Kellaway's eyebrows rose with the practiced concern of a man who'd built his career on solving other people's problems for a substantial fee. On nothing that can't be addressed through proper channels, I hope. Instead of answering directly, McCready stepped closer to Tom Lightfoot's body and studied the dead warrior with professional interest. His boot nudged the cavalry saber still clutched in the young man's hand, noting the notches in its blade and the dried blood that told its own story of desperate fighting against impossible odds. This weapon, he said quietly, belonged to Lieutenant William Morrison of C Company 2nd Cavalry. Fine young officer from a good Philadelphia family. Graduated second in his class from the academy and volunteered for frontier service out of a sense of patriotic duty. Jake felt ice form in his veins as he realized where this conversation was heading. Morrison, same name as his own, though Jake had never claimed connection to Philadelphia society or West Point honor codes. Lieutenant Morrison died at Sacred Springs. McCready continued his voice, carrying the flat finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Killed in single combat by this particular savage, who then had the audacity to escape with a weapon that belonged to the United States Army. A weapon that represents the honor of American military service and the sacrifice of a young man who died serving his country's interests. The colonel's pale eyes swept the room again, studying each face for signs of guilt or complicity. Naturally, the Army takes a dim view of enemy combatants who collect trophies from our fallen officers. Such behavior indicates a level of military organization and tactical sophistication that poses significant threats to civilian settlements throughout the territory. Billy couldn't contain himself any longer, his youth and inexperience overriding whatever common sense he might have possessed. So what are you going to do about it, Colonel? That savage is already dead, and he ain't going to be killing any more soldiers. McCready's attention focused on Billy with the intensity of a magnifying glass, concentrating sunlight into flame. An excellent question, young man. The answer, I'm afraid, is somewhat complex. You see, Lieutenant Morrison wasn't killed in open battle against uniformly armed enemies. He was murdered during a peace negotiation conducted under protection of a white flag. The words hit Jake like physical blows, each revelation worse than the last. Tom Lightfoot hadn't been a warrior attacking soldiers in battle. He'd been part of a peace delegation trying to prevent exactly the kind of massacre that had followed. Which meant McCready hadn't just violated federal law and military honor. He deliberately engineered the situation to justify genocide while claiming self-defense. The implications. McCready continued in the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather, are rather serious. If word spreads that Army officers can be killed with impunity during diplomatic negotiations, It could encourage other hostile elements to test our resolve through similar acts of treachery. Kane's expression had grown steadily grimmer as he processed the colonel's carefully coded language. As mine foreman, he understood better than most how territorial politics worked and what happened to settlements that found themselves on the wrong side of military policy. "What exactly are you proposing, Colonel?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, in the way of men who'd learned to navigate dangerous waters by reading currents and winds with professional skill. "I'm proposing that Copper Creek demonstrate its loyalty to territorial development and American civilization by assisting in the apprehension of additional hostile elements who might be operating in this region." McCready's smile was sharp as a scalping knife and twice as deadly. Elements who might have provided aid and comfort to the savage who murdered Lieutenant Morrison. The trap was sprung with elegant simplicity, Jake realized. McCready needed scapegoats to justify his massacre, and he'd found them in the form of anyone who'd shown sympathy for Tom Lightfoot's final moments. Anyone who'd treated the dying warrior with basic human decency could now be classified as a hostile collaborator, deserving of military justice. "I see," Kane said slowly, his mind working through implications and possibilities with the methodical precision of an engineer calculating stress loads on mined timbers. "And how would you suggest we identify such elements?" "Oh, I think identification won't be particularly difficult." McCready's gaze settled on Jake with predatory satisfaction. "For instance, I couldn't help but notice this gentleman's solicitous care for the enemy combatant's remains. Quite touching, really. Almost as if he felt some personal connection to the savage's cause." Jake rose slowly to his feet, his hands held carefully away from his weapons, while he calculated distances and angles with the automatic precision of someone who'd survived too many such confrontations to count them. 12 soldiers, all armed, all trained, all following orders from an officer who'd already demonstrated his willingness to murder civilians in pursuit of his objectives. Man was dying. He said quietly, his voice carrying no hint of the rage building in his chest, like pressure in a boiler approaching explosion. Seemed only decent to treat him with respect in his final moments. Respect. McCready savored the word like wine that had turned to vinegar. "How remarkably progressive of you. Tell me, Mr. Morrison, Jake Morrison." The colonel's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. "Morrison, how fascinating. Any relation to the late Lieutenant Morrison who died so tragically at Sacred Springs?" "Not that I know of. It's a common enough name." "Indeed it is. Though I find it curious that two men sharing the same name should find themselves connected by such tragic circumstances. Almost as if fate were trying to tell us something about the nature of justice and the price of betraying American interests in favor of savage sympathies." Dr. Kellaway cleared his throat with the delicate precision of a man sensing opportunity in chaos. "Colonel, perhaps we're allowing ourselves to become distracted from more pressing practical considerations. Mr. Morrison's humanitarian instincts aside, the immediate question facing Copper Creek involves defensive preparations against possible retaliatory attacks." "An excellent point, Doctor. Which brings me to the primary purpose of my visit." McCready reached into his uniform coat and withdrew a folded document sealed with official wax and ribbons that proclaimed its authority to anyone who could read territorial law. "By order of the Territorial Governor and the Department of the Interior, all settlements within 50 miles of Sacred Springs are hereby placed under martial law for the duration of the current military emergency. Civilian authorities will cooperate fully with military commanders in maintaining order and protecting American lives and property from hostile elements." Kane accepted the document with hands that remained steady despite the implications of what he was reading. Martial law meant military justice, military courts, and military executions for anyone who opposed the Army's interpretation of territorial policy. It meant Colonel Macready had legal authority to do whatever he pleased to maintain what he defined as order. "The provisions are quite comprehensive," Kellaway observed after reading over Kane's shoulder, "though I notice certain aspects might prove challenging to implement given our limited manpower and resources. Which is why I'm authorized to conscript able-bodied civilian males for auxiliary military service." Macready replied with the satisfaction of a man who'd anticipated every possible objection. "Including you, Mr. Morrison. Consider yourself drafted into service as a military scout, effective immediately." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Conscription into military service under these circumstances wasn't an honor, it was a death sentence disguised as patriotic duty. Macready needed someone to blame for his massacre, and Jake had just volunteered by showing basic human decency to a dying enemy. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Colonel," Jake said carefully, his mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to the same bloody conclusion. "I've got pressing business elsewhere that can't wait for military emergencies to resolve themselves. I'm afraid your business will have to wait." Macready's voice carried the absolute authority of federal law, backed by force of arms. "Desertion during wartime is a capital offense, Mr. Morrison. Surely a man of your apparent experience understands the consequences of refusing legitimate military orders." Around the saloon, patrons were carefully avoiding eye contact with the drama unfolding at center stage. These were frontier men who'd learned to survive by recognizing when situations had moved beyond their ability to influence outcomes through normal means. When federal authority confronted individual conscience, smart money stayed neutral and hoped to avoid becoming collateral damage. But Jake had never been particularly smart about choosing his battles, and his conscience had gotten him into more trouble than his gun skills had ever gotten him out of. "I understand the consequences just fine, Colonel. Question is whether you understand them well enough to live with what comes next." The challenge hung in the air like powder smoke, heavy with implications that made every soldier in the room shift nervously and adjust their grip on their weapons. They'd been expecting routine intimidation of civilian troublemakers, not a confrontation with someone who spoke like he'd been calculating odds of survival and found them acceptable. Macready's expression didn't change, but something cold and deadly flickered behind his pale eyes. The look of a man who'd killed before and would kill again without losing sleep over moral complications. "Sergeant Williams, place Mr. Morrison under arrest for suspected collaboration with hostile elements and resistance to lawful military authority." But before Sergeant Williams could respond, the saloon's rear door burst open with a crash that made every man present reach for his weapon. Through the entrance came a figure that stopped conversations and prayers alike. A Paiute war chief in full ceremonial dress, his face painted for battle, his eyes burning with the cold fire of righteous vengeance. Behind him came 20 warriors, all armed, all ready to die, fighting, all carrying the particular stillness that preceded sudden death in close quarters. They'd entered through the back, while everyone's attention was focused on the confrontation between Jake and Colonel Macready, moving with the silent efficiency of professional killers who knew their business. "I am Chief Winnemucca," the war chief announced in perfect English that carried only the faintest trace of accent, his voice filling the saloon like thunder rolling across desert mountains. "I have come for my nephew's body and for answers about the massacre of innocents at Sacred Springs." Colonel Macready turned slowly to face this new threat, his hand resting on his saber hilt with casual readiness that spoke of complete confidence in his ability to handle whatever violence might follow. "Chief Winnemucca, your reputation precedes you, though I'm afraid your nephew died while resisting lawful military operations in contested territory. My nephew died carrying a white flag and a peace treaty signed by your territorial governor." Winnemucca replied with deadly quiet that was far more threatening than shouting would have been. "He died trying to prevent the very war that your massacre has now made inevitable." The war chief stepped closer to Tom Lightfoot's body, his painted face revealing nothing of the grief that must have been tearing at his heart like winter wind through summer cloth. But his eyes held depths of sorrow and rage that spoke of a man pushed beyond endurance into the realm where only blood could balance the scales of justice. "You will return my nephew's body for proper burial according to the customs of our people." He continued, his voice never rising above conversational level, but carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "And you will answer for the murder of women and children who never raised weapons against your soldiers." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," McCready replied with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never encountered opposition he couldn't crush through superior firepower. "Enemy combatants killed while resisting federal authority are subject to military jurisdiction. The body will be disposed of according to Army regulations to prevent contamination of civilian areas." The silence that followed was thick as blood and twice as dangerous. Every man in the saloon understood they were witnessing the moment when talk ended and killing began, when careful words gave way to sudden death measured in heartbeats and gunshots. Chief Winnemucca's hand moved to the war axe at his belt, with practiced ease that spoke of countless battles fought and won through speed skill and absolute ruthlessness when the situation demanded such measures. Around him, his warriors shifted into combat positions with the fluid precision of men who trained together until they could fight as a single organism. "Then we will take what is ours," the chief said quietly, "and you will learn the price of breaking sacred promises." The first shot shattered the tense silence like glass breaking under pressure, though Jake never saw who fired it. One moment, 26 armed men were staring at each other across a saloon floor, slick with spilled whiskey and tobacco juice. The next, the confined space erupted into chaos that would have impressed battlefield veterans from Bull Run to Gettysburg. Jake's reflexes honed by 2 decades of staying alive. In places where hesitation meant death sent him diving behind the solid oak bar as bullets began flying with deadly precision. The thick wood shuddered under repeated impacts, splinters exploding in razor-sharp showers that drew blood from anyone too slow to find proper cover. Above the thunderous roar of gunfire, he could hear voices shouting orders in 3 languages, English Paiute, and the universal grammar of violence that transcended cultural boundaries. Colonel McCready was barking commands to his soldiers with parade ground authority, while Chief Winnemucca issued instructions to his warriors in their native tongue, each word crisp as rifle shots. A cavalry trooper stumbled backward into Jake's line of sight, clutching his throat with hands that couldn't stop arterial blood from painting his blue uniform crimson. His eyes held the particular surprise of someone who'd expected to intimidate civilians and instead found himself dying in a frontier saloon beside a dead Paiute warrior, whose spirit was probably laughing at the cosmic justice of it all. The soldier hit the floor with a wet thud that was immediately lost in the continuing gunfire, his final breath escaping in a sigh that mixed with the acrid smoke filling the air, like fog rolling off a lake at dawn. Jake noted the man's rifle lying within reach and began calculating the risk of retrieving additional firepower against the certainty of exposing himself to enemy fire. "Morrison," Kane's voice cut through the chaos from somewhere near the poker table, where the mine foreman had overturned the heavy wooden surface to create an improvised fortress. "You still breathing over there?" "For now," Jake shouted back, working his way toward the dead soldier's weapon, while keeping his head below the level of flying lead. "Situation's a mite more complicated than your average Saturday night disagreement," A Paiute warrior appeared at the bar's end, war paint making his face look like something from a fever dream tomahawk, raised for a killing blow that would end Jake's participation in the evening's festivities permanently. But Jake's Colt was already in his hand, the barrels swinging up with practiced ease that came from too many such moments to count. The revolver roared flame blooming from its muzzle like a deadly flower, and the warrior spun sideways into a table that collapsed under his weight with a crash of splintering wood and shattering glass. Jake felt no satisfaction in the kill, only the grim necessity of staying alive long enough to find some way out of this massacre that wouldn't leave him joining the growing collection of corpses decorating the saloon floor. Through the smoke and chaos, he glimpsed Chief Winnemucca moving through the battle like a force of nature, his war axe rising and falling with mechanical precision while soldiers died beneath its edge. The chief's face remained calm, as still water showing no emotion beyond professional concentration as he worked his way toward Tom Lightfoot's body with single-minded determination. Colonel McCready had taken cover behind an overturned table near the front door, his service revolver, speaking with measured authority as he directed his remaining soldiers with tactical precision that spoke of considerable battlefield experience. But even Jake's untrained eye could see the colonel was losing this fight badly. Paiute warriors were simply better at close-quarters combat than cavalry troopers trained for mounted operations on open ground. Sergeant Williams. McCready called to his senior non-commissioned officer, who was bleeding from a scalp wound that had turned his face into a crimson mask. Fall back to the street, establish defensive perimeter around the building. But Sergeant Williams was beyond following orders, his lifeless eyes staring at ceiling beams while his blood pooled beneath furniture that would never serve customers again. Half of McCready's force was dead or dying, and the survivors were more concerned with staying alive than maintaining military formation. Billy Garrett crouched behind the piano, his pearl-handled Colt bucking in his hands, as he tried to nail a warrior who kept appearing and disappearing like smoke and wind. The kid was fast and accurate, but speed meant nothing when your enemies were using terrain and tactics your training hadn't prepared you to counter. Billy, Dr. Kellaway's voice carried surprising authority for a man who looked like he'd never held anything more dangerous than a surgical scalpel. Cover the rear exit, don't let them flank us. The young gunfighter nodded and began working his way toward the back door, moving with fluid grace that reminded Jake of a cat stalking prey through tall grass. But a Paiute warrior was already there, having anticipated exactly that tactical necessity, and Billy's speed wasn't quite fast enough to save his life. The warrior's blade caught Billy just below the ribs, angling upward with surgical precision that found heart and lungs with the first thrust. The kid's eyes went wide with shock and pain, his mouth opening to scream words that would never be spoken. He collapsed against the wall, his fancy gun clattering across floorboards already slick with blood from a dozen different wounds. Dr. Kellaway saw his protege fall and reacted with surprising speed for a man of his soft appearance, producing a derringer from his vest pocket and putting both barrels into the warrior's chest at point-blank range. The small caliber bullets didn't have much stopping power, but they were enough to send the dying man backward into furniture that broke under his weight. Enough. Chief Winnemucca's voice cut through the gunfire like a blade through cloth, carrying absolute authority that made even his own warriors pause in their deadly work. We have what we came for. Jake raised his head above the bar and saw the chief standing over Tom Lightfoot's body, having fought his way across a saloon floor littered with corpses to reach his nephew's remains. Blood streaked his war paint, and his buckskin shirt bore bullet holes that had somehow missed vital organs, but his eyes still burned with the cold fire of righteous vengeance, only partially satisfied. Colonel McCready struggled to his feet, his uniform torn and stained with blood that wasn't entirely his own. Of his original dozen soldiers, only 3 remained capable of fighting, and they looked more interested in survival then continuing tactical operations against an enemy that had proved considerably more dangerous than anticipated. This isn't finished. The colonel said, his voice carrying the flat promise of someone who viewed temporary setbacks as minor obstacles to ultimate victory. You've just declared war on the United States Army and the territorial government. There will be consequences for this act of savagery that your people will regret for generations. Chief Winnemucca bent and gathered Tom Lightfoot's body with careful reverence, cradling the young warrior's remains like a father holding a sleeping child. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of ancient wisdom and bitter experience that had taught him exactly what white promises were worth. We declared nothing. You brought war to our people with murder and betrayal, and now you complain when war follows you home like a faithful dog. The chief's eyes swept the carnage around them, cataloging the cost of Colonel Macready's ambitions with the cold precision of an accountant tallying debts. But you are correct about one thing: this is not finished. It will not be finished until justice is satisfied and the spirits of innocence can rest in peace. With that pronouncement, the surviving Paiutes began withdrawing through the rear exit with tactical precision that spoke of considerable military experience. They moved like smoke dissipating in wind, carrying their dead and wounded with efficient teamwork, while maintaining enough firepower to discourage pursuit. In less than 3 minutes, the saloon fell silent, except for the moans of wounded men, and the settling sounds of shattered furniture finding new configurations on blood-soaked floors. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the copper tang of spilled blood and the particular stench of sudden death in confined spaces. Jake rose slowly from behind the bar, his ears ringing from gunfire and his eyes stinging from smoke that hung in the air like morning fog. Around him, the Broken Wheel Saloon looked like a battlefield. After the armies had moved on, bodies sprawled in unnatural positions, furniture reduced to kindling bottles and glasses, creating a sparkling carpet of broken dreams and shattered hopes. Kane pulled himself upright with visible effort, blood seeping from a wound in his left shoulder that had torn through muscle and possibly chipped bone. "Well," he said with dark humor that spoke of a man who'd survived worse disasters through sheer stubborn refusal to die. "That could have gone better." Dr. Kellaway was kneeling beside Billy Garrett's body, his trained fingers searching for vital signs that were never going to return. The young gunfighter's face held a surprised expression, as if death had interrupted him in the middle of an important thought. His pearl-handled Colt lay nearby, its fancy grip now stained with blood from fingers that would never draw it again. He was fast, the doctor observed with clinical detachment that masked whatever grief he might have felt for his dead protege. But not quite fast enough. Frontier justice has a way of correcting character flaws with brutal efficiency. Colonel Macready was already moving among his surviving soldiers, conducting a damage assessment with military precision despite the chaos surrounding them. Of his original force, 7 men lay dead, and 2 more were wounded badly enough that their fighting effectiveness was questionable at best. Sergeant Davies, he called to his senior surviving non-commissioned officer, a grizzled veteran whose scarred face spoke of previous encounters with hostile forces. "Gather our dead for burial with military honors. Then send runners to Fort Laramie requesting immediate reinforcement of not less than company strength." "Yes, sir," Davies replied, though his voice carried the particular weariness of a professional soldier who'd seen too many young men die for causes they didn't fully understand. "What about civilian casualties, sir?" Macready's pale eyes swept the saloon, cataloging bodies and assessing the political implications of what had just occurred in a territory where federal authority rested on the consent of armed civilians who could disappear into wilderness if pushed too hard. "Civilian casualties are regrettable but unavoidable when hostile forces choose to attack settlements under protection of territorial law," he said with the practiced ease of someone who'd written similar reports many times. "These men died defending American interests against savage aggression. Their sacrifice will be remembered appropriately." Translation: the official report would blame everything on Paiute aggression while ignoring the circumstances that had led to Tom Lightfoot seeking refuge in Copper Creek. The massacre at Sacred Springs would be justified as necessary military action, and anyone who suggested otherwise would find themselves classified as hostile sympathizers deserving of similar treatment. Jake felt his jaw clench as he listened to McCready rewriting history to suit his purposes, but discretion overruled indignation in the face of superior firepower and legal authority backed by federal warrant. The colonel had already demonstrated his willingness to use both with lethal efficiency. "What about the evidence of treaty violations?" he asked, knowing the answer, but needing to hear it spoken aloud. Tom Lightfoot was carrying a white flag and official documentation when he came here. "I see no evidence of any such documentation," McCready replied with the flat certainty of someone accustomed to having his version of events accepted without question. "What I see is the aftermath of a coordinated attack by hostile forces against civilian and military personnel engaged in lawful territorial business." Dr. Kellaway nodded slowly, his politician's instincts, recognizing the shape of survival in circumstances where moral objections were luxury items nobody could afford. "Quite right, Colonel. Though I suspect the territorial governor will want a detailed report on security failures that allowed such an attack to succeed. Naturally. Which is why I'm implementing enhanced security measures effective immediately." McCready's voice carried the authority of someone who'd anticipated this objection and prepared responses that would satisfy territorial bureaucrats. "All civilian movement will be restricted to essential business only. Curfew from sunset to sunrise. Any gathering of more than 3 persons requires military approval." The net was tightening with bureaucratic precision, Jake realized. Martial law gave McCready authority to control every aspect of civilian life, which meant anyone who opposed his version of events could be eliminated as a security threat without messy legal complications. Kane gingerly probed his shoulder wound, wincing as his fingers found torn muscle and bone fragments that would need medical attention soon if he wanted to keep full use of his arm. "Begging your pardon, Colonel, but enhanced security measures are all well and good for maintaining order. Question is whether we've got enough manpower to enforce them against determined resistance." "An excellent point, Mr. Kane. Which brings me to my original proposition regarding civilian conscription for auxiliary military service." McCready's pale eyes settled on Jake with predatory satisfaction. "Mr. Morrison, you're hereby drafted as a military scout with immediate effect. Your first assignment will be tracking the hostile forces that just attacked this establishment." The trap closed with elegant simplicity. Jake could refuse and be shot as a deserter or accept and be sent into wilderness where Paiute warriors would kill him for his association with McCready's crimes. Either way, the colonel eliminated a potential witness while maintaining legal authority. "I'm afraid my tracking skills aren't what they used to be," Jake said carefully, his mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to the same bloody conclusion. "Man my age probably isn't the best choice for such demanding work." "False modesty doesn't suit you, Mr. Morrison. Your performance during tonight's unpleasantness demonstrated considerable tactical awareness and combat experience. Exactly the qualifications needed for specialized reconnaissance work." Before Jake could formulate a response that wouldn't get him shot immediately, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the settlement, many horses moving with disciplined precision that spoke of military organization. Through the saloon's shattered windows, they could see torches approaching like fallen stars, their light reflecting off brass buttons and cavalry sabers. Reinforcements, Sergeant Davies observed with professional satisfaction. About time, if you ask me. But as the riders drew closer, Jake could see these weren't additional cavalry troopers responding to McCready's situation. The uniforms were wrong, for the equipment was different, and the lead rider carried himself with the particular authority of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them. Colonel McCready stepped outside to greet the newcomers, his posture shifting from confident authority to carefully neutral recognition as he identified the approaching officer. When he spoke, surprise and something that might have been concern colored his voice. "Colonel Whitmore, this is unexpected." Colonel James Whitmore dismounted with the efficient movements of a career cavalry officer, his weathered face bearing the particular lines that came from too many years squinting into harsh sunlight and bitter wind. Unlike McCready's pristine uniform, Whitmore's showed honest wear from extended field service, and his pale eyes held depths that spoke of someone who'd seen enough war to understand its true cost. "Colonel McCready, I received disturbing reports about irregular military operations in this sector. Thought I'd investigate personally before filing my report with Territorial Command." Whitmore's voice carried casual authority that masked iron determination to get answers regardless of political consequences. "Perhaps you'd care to explain why Sacred Springs was attacked without proper authorization." The question hung in the air, like smoke from gunpowder, heavy with implications that could end careers and send men to military prison if answered incorrectly. McCready's face remained carefully neutral, but Jake could see tension building in his shoulders like a spring being wound too tight. Sacred Springs was a legitimate military target, harboring hostile elements that posed direct threats to territorial security. McCready replied with the practiced ease of someone who'd rehearsed such explanations. Intelligence reports indicated treaty violations and coordination with enemy forces throughout the region. Intelligence reports. Whitmore's tone suggested he'd found something distasteful on the sole of his boot. Would those be the same intelligence reports that classified women and children as enemy combatants? The same reports that authorized attacking a neutral trading post protected by federal treaty. Jake felt hope flickering in his chest, like a candle flame in wind. Colonel Whitmore wasn't part of McCready's conspiracy. He represented federal authority that answered to Washington rather than territorial politicians, which meant there might be a chance for justice after all. But hope was a dangerous luxury in circumstances where survival depended on reading political currents correctly, and Jake had learned to be suspicious of apparent allies who appeared too conveniently. Frontier politics were complicated by competing interests, jurisdictional disputes, and the particular corruption that flourished where federal oversight was sporadic at best. Perhaps this discussion would be better conducted in private, Dr. Kellaway suggested with the diplomatic instincts of someone who'd spent his career managing sensitive negotiations, away from civilian ears that might misinterpret operational details. Colonel Whitmore's gaze swept the blood-soaked saloon, taking in the carnage with professional assessment that missed nothing important. On the contrary, Doctor, I think civilian witnesses might prove quite valuable in establishing exactly what happened here and at Sacred Springs. His attention focused on Jake with the intensity of someone who learned to identify reliable sources of information through years of separating truth from convenient fiction. "You were present during tonight's engagement, Mr. Morrison, Jake Morrison." Jake stepped forward with careful dignity that acknowledged Whitmore's authority while maintaining his own self-respect. "I was indeed present, sir. Saw the whole thing from start to finish." "Excellent. Then perhaps you can provide an objective account of events leading up to this altercation." Before Jake could answer, McCready interjected with smooth authority that carried just enough threat to be unmistakable. "I'm afraid Mr. Morrison is now under military jurisdiction as a conscripted scout. Any testimony he might provide would be subject to security considerations and command discretion. Would it indeed? Whitmore's voice carried Arctic cold that made hardened soldiers check their weapons unconsciously. How interesting. And under whose authority was this conscription conducted? Territorial martial law proclamation signed by Governor Harrison and approved by the Department of the Interior. McCready produced the document with triumphant satisfaction. Mr. Morrison falls under military command, effective immediately. Colonel Whitmore accepted the papers and studied them with careful attention to detail his expression growing grimmer with each line of bureaucratic language that granted sweeping powers to territorial commanders. When he finished reading, his face held the particular disgust of a professional soldier confronted with political corruption disguised as military necessity. Fascinating document. He observed with deceptive mildness that fooled nobody present. Though I notice it lacks certain signatures required for legitimate authorization of martial law in territories with established federal jurisdiction. The signatures are perfectly legitimate, Dr. Kellaway protested with injured dignity. Governor Harrison's authority in territorial matters is well established through previous precedent and superseded by federal authority when military operations affect treaty obligations with sovereign Indian nations. Whitmore interrupted with precise legal knowledge that cut through territorial bluster like a sharp blade through silk. Which means any actions taken under this supposedly legitimate proclamation may constitute violations of federal law, subject to court-martial proceedings. The implications hit McCready like physical blows, each word revealing how thoroughly he'd miscalculated the political ramifications of his actions. Federal court-martial meant federal judges, federal prosecutors, and federal prison sentences that couldn't be commuted by territorial governors seeking to protect their associates. "Colonel," he said carefully, "I believe you may be operating under certain misconceptions regarding jurisdictional authority in contested territories. Perhaps we should contact Territorial Command for clarification of—" "I've already contacted Territorial Command," Whitmore replied with cold satisfaction. Along with the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and several congressional committees that take considerable interest in treaty violations and unauthorized military operations. They're all quite eager to review evidence regarding recent events in this sector. Jake felt the political winds shifting like weather before a storm, power relationships realigning with each word spoken by officers who represented different aspects of federal authority. Whitmore commanded respect because he answered to Washington politicians who could end careers with telegraphed orders, while McCready's authority depended on territorial officials whose power evaporated when confronted by federal investigation. Evidence. Kane repeated thoughtfully, his practical mind seizing on the word that would determine whether any of them survived the coming political earthquake. What sort of evidence would your various committees find most illuminating? Colonel Whitmore, eyewitness testimony from reliable sources would be quite valuable. Whitmore replied, his meaning unmistakable to everyone present. Particularly testimony from individuals who observed events at Sacred Springs and the circumstances leading to tonight's violence. The offer hung in the air like morning mist, offering protection in exchange for truth. But only if Jake was willing to bet his life on Colonel Whitmore's ability to deliver on promises made in a frontier saloon surrounded by dead men and political wreckage. Around them, the survivors of the evening's bloodshed waited to see which way the wind would blow their futures, hanging in the balance between competing versions of justice and authority. In the distance, smoke continued rising from Copper Creek's chimneys, carrying the dreams and fears of people who'd come west seeking opportunity, but found themselves trapped between corrupt officials and righteous vengeance. The next word spoken would determine whether justice was possible in a territory where silver mattered more than human lives. and whether a single witness could stand against the combined power of territorial government and military authority. Jake looked around the blood-soaked saloon at the dead men who died for other people's ambitions, at the survivors who were calculating their odds of living through whatever came next. Then he looked at Colonel Whitmore's weathered face and made the decision that would define the rest of his life, however long that might prove to be. "Colonel," he said quietly, "I reckon there's quite a story needs telling. Question is whether anyone's prepared to listen to the whole truth, no matter where it leads or who it implicates." "Mr. Morrison," Whitmore replied with grim satisfaction, "I guarantee you'll have the most attentive audience this side of the Mississippi River." 3 months later, Denver, Colorado Territory. The federal courthouse stood like a monument to justice in the heart of Denver, its stone facade weathered by mountain storms, but unbroken by the political winds that had destroyed lesser institutions. Jake Morrison climbed its steps with the measured pace of a man who'd learned the difference between hurrying toward justice and running from consequences. Behind him walked Colonel Whitmore, now serving as chief military prosecutor in a case that had captured national attention and prompted congressional hearings about territorial corruption. The colonel's uniform bore new insignia reflecting his promotion and expanded authority to investigate treaty violations throughout the Western Territories. Inside the courtroom, the gallery was packed with newspaper reporters, territorial officials, and curious citizens who'd come to witness the trial that would determine whether federal law applied equally to all Americans or only to those with insufficient political connections to avoid accountability. At the defendant's table sat Colonel Thaddeus McCready, his once pristine uniform now bearing the wrinkled appearance of a man who'd spent too many nights in federal custody awaiting trial for multiple counts of murder treaty violation and conspiracy against the territorial government. His pale eyes had lost their predatory gleam, replaced by the hollow stare of someone who'd miscalculated political currents and found himself drowning in consequences. Beside him sat Dr. Martin Kellaway, the territorial mining commissioner, whose careful manipulation of legal documents had enabled the entire conspiracy. His soft hands were shackled with iron restraints that marked him as a flight risk, though his political connections had prevented him from sharing a cell with common criminals. The prosecution table held a collection of federal attorneys whose combined legal expertise had been assembled specifically to handle this case. They'd spent months building an ironclad presentation that would demonstrate the scope of corruption infecting territorial government and the military commands that supposedly served federal interests. Judge William Hayes presided over proceedings with the stern dignity of someone who'd spent 30 years on the federal bench watching justice struggle against political expediency. His reputation for impartiality was legendary, as was his intolerance for courtroom theatrics from attorneys who thought federal judges could be impressed by territorial political connections. "Mr. Morrison," the lead prosecutor called, "please tell the court what you observed at the Broken Wheel Saloon on the evening of December 17th, 1873. Jake rose from the witness stand and faced the gallery, his weathered features calm, despite the knowledge that his testimony would determine the fate of men who'd commanded considerable power just months earlier. His words came steady and clear, carrying the weight of truth spoken by someone who'd risked everything to see justice served. "Tom Lightfoot came to us wounded and dying, carrying evidence of a massacre at Sacred Springs that violated every treaty and law that was supposed to protect innocent people. He died trying to warn folks about what was coming, and he died with dignity despite everything that had been done to his people." He paused his gaze, finding Colonel McCready's face, and holding it with steady accusation that required no legal interpretation. Colonel McCready and his associates murdered women and children under protection of a white flag, then tried to cover their crimes by eliminating witnesses and falsifying reports. They used territorial authority to justify genocide for profit, and they nearly succeeded. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations and shuffled papers as reporters scribbled notes that would appear in newspapers from New York to San Francisco. The territorial officials in attendance looked increasingly uncomfortable as Jake's testimony revealed the scope of corruption that had infected their administration. "And what evidence do you have to support these serious allegations?" The prosecutor continued building toward the dramatic revelation that would seal the defendant's fate. Jake reached into his coat and withdrew the documents that had started the entire chain of events: Tom Lightfoot's treaty papers, sworn affidavits taken under oath, and the correspondence between territorial officials and mining interests that proved the conspiracy reached the highest levels of government. Evidence written in their own hands, signed with their own names, and sealed with official stamps that can't be forged or explained away. His voice carried quiet satisfaction, born of seeing long-delayed justice finally approaching like sunrise after the darkest night. Evidence that proves every word I've spoken and condemns every lie they've told. The trial continued for 6 weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses who painted a comprehensive picture of territorial corruption and military misconduct that shocked even federal officials accustomed to frontier lawlessness. When the verdicts were finally rendered, they reflected justice delayed, but not denied. Colonel McCready was convicted on all counts and sentenced to hang for the murder of federal treaty negotiators and civilians under protection of federal law. Dr. Kellaway received life imprisonment for conspiracy and fraud. His soft hands destined to learn the texture of federal prison walls rather than territorial political documents. A dozen other territorial officials received various sentences ranging from prison terms to prohibition from holding federal office, effectively dismantling the corrupt network that had controlled mining rights throughout the region. The territorial governor himself was recalled to Washington for congressional questioning that would end his political career in well-deserved disgrace. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the establishment of new federal oversight protocols for territorial development, ensuring that future mining operations would be conducted under strict federal supervision rather than local political control. The Paiute Nation received federal recognition and protection for their remaining territories, along with compensation for the Sacred Springs massacre that could never fully restore what had been lost. Chief Winnemucca attended the final day of proceedings, his presence a silent reminder of the human cost of territorial greed and the price of justice in a land where power had been divorced from accountability for too long. When the sentences were announced, he nodded with grim satisfaction, but showed no joy. Justice served could never bring back the women and children who died at Sacred Springs. After the trial concluded, Jake found himself standing on the courthouse steps again, this time watching as former territorial officials were led away in shackles that marked the end of their careers and the beginning of federal sentences they'd spend regretting their choices. Colonel Whitmore joined him, and the two men sharing the particular silence that came after long struggles finally reached their conclusion. They'd fought together for justice against superior forces and political corruption, and they'd won through patience, evidence, and the kind of moral courage that seemed increasingly rare in territories where silver mattered more than human lives. "What will you do now?" Whitmore asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity about the future of a man who'd risked everything to see justice served. Jake considered the question while studying the Denver skyline, its buildings reaching toward mountain peaks that had witnessed countless human dramas played out against the eternal backdrop of stone and sky. His testimony had made him enemies among surviving territorial officials, but it had also earned him federal protection and the kind of reputation that opened doors previously closed to frontier drifters. "Reckon I'll head north," he said finally, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. "Heard tell there's settlements up Montana way that could use someone with experience keeping the peace between folks who don't always see eye to eye on matters of justice and territorial development." "Federal marshal's position," Whitmore observed with approval. "The territory could use someone with your particular qualifications and moral compass. Too much of the frontier is still controlled by men like McCready and Kellaway men who view law as something to be bent for personal profit rather than respected for public good. They shook hands with the firm grip of men who'd served together in a cause greater than their individual interests, then parted ways, knowing their paths might never cross again. But their shared commitment to justice would continue in whatever territories they served. As Jake walked toward the livery stable where his horse waited, he reflected on the long journey from a poker game in a frontier saloon to testimony in a federal courthouse that had toppled a corrupt territorial government. Tom Lightfoot's death had been avenged, the massacre at Sacred Springs had been acknowledged and punished, and a precedent had been established that would protect other tribes from similar atrocities. But the cost had been measured in blood and silver, in lives lost and careers destroyed, in the particular moral weight that came from standing against powerful men who viewed human beings as obstacles to territorial development. Justice had been served, but justice had demanded everything from those who served it. The horse that carried him north toward Montana was the same one that had brought him to Copper Creek months earlier. But the man in the saddle was different, transformed by witnessing the worst of human nature and the best of human courage tempered by fire and blood into someone who understood the true price of civilization on the American frontier. Behind him, Denver continued growing toward the sky, its buildings filled with people pursuing dreams of prosperity and opportunity, in a land that offered both in equal measure with violence and moral compromise. Ahead lay Montana Territory, with its own conflicts between native peoples and white settlers, its own corrupt officials and righteous citizens, its own need for men willing to stand between civilization and chaos. But Jake Morrison rode north with quiet confidence, born of experience and validated by results. He'd learned that justice was possible even in territories where silver mattered more than human lives, if you were willing to pay the price it demanded and accept the consequences it required. The story of Copper Creek would be told and retold in newspapers and congressional reports in tribal histories and frontier legends in courtrooms and saloons throughout the Western Territories. It would serve as warning to corrupt officials and inspiration to those who believed federal law should apply equally to all Americans, regardless of their political connections or territorial authority. And somewhere in that growing legend, Tom Lightfoot's spirit could finally rest in peace, knowing his death had not been meaningless, and his people's suffering had not been ignored by a justice system that too often favored power over righteousness. The silver that had caused so much death and corruption continued flowing from mountain veins into territorial coffers. But now it flowed under federal oversight that ensured its extraction served the common good rather than private greed. The mines that had been built on blood and broken treaties now operated under laws that protected both workers and native peoples from the kind of exploitation that had characterized the old territorial system. Justice had been served, but justice was never final. It required constant vigilance from men and women willing to stand against corruption wherever it appeared, whether in territorial governments or federal agencies, whether in mining camps or congressional offices. The price of civilization was eternal vigilance against those who would pervert law for personal gain and sacrifice human lives for material profit. Jake Morrison understood that price and had paid it willingly, earning the right to wear a federal marshal's badge in territories where such symbols still meant something to people who believed in the possibility of justice under law. His story would continue in Montana and beyond, wherever corruption confronted conscience and power struggled against principle. But for now, he rode north with quiet satisfaction and hard-won wisdom, carrying the memory of Tom Lightfoot's courage and Chief Winnemucca's dignity, bearing witness to the truth that justice was possible, even in the harshest territories, if you were willing to fight for it with everything you possessed. The silver and the blood had been weighed in federal scales and found wanting. But the men who died seeking justice had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had bought precedent and protection for others who would follow, ensuring that frontier justice would grow closer to federal justice with each passing year. And in the growing legend of the Copper Creek trials, future generations would find proof that ordinary men could stand against extraordinary corruption and prevail through courage, evidence, and the kind of moral determination that defined the best of American civilization. Pushing westward across a continent that tested every principle it claimed to embody.